Dalia Gebrial, thank you so much for joining us in Divided. I wonder if we might start where we always tend to do. For people who don't know who you are, how would you describe yourself?
So I would probably describe myself first and foremost as a writer. I'm also an academic and a researcher. And in terms of my politics, I would describe myself as a feminist and a socialist as well. And I think those two things are really intimately tied.
Well, what does being a feminist then mean to you? And obviously, being a socialist, you say, is very firmly part of that. Explain that.
So for me, feminism is sometimes misrepresented as being about a battle of the sexes, right? For me, it's much more about a critique of society as we run it. I think that a lot of the traits that we consider to be feminine or that are labelled feminine, like care and intimacy and collectivism and community, should actually be centred in our society rather than sidelined and devalued. And for me, feminism is very much about improving the lives of women as a majority. It's looking at the most marginalised, the most vulnerable women and really focusing on them rather than the kind of hashtag I'm with her, sort of Hilary Clinton-style feminism of putting basically just a woman on top of a system that harms the majority of women beneath it. In terms of your own feminism, when did that start to come to the fore? Because it's pretty clearly, anyone who's aware of your work would know, it's pretty clearly a large part of who you are. It was through experiences of harassment, experiences of assault that I couldn't understand at the time, and I didn't understand a lot of the quite contradictory and overwhelming feelings that I had as a consequence of that. And that turned me on to, first of all, sort of feminist literature. So novelists like Noel El-Saadawi, who's an Egyptian feminist, that really, really influenced me. And feminist literature really helped me to make sense of what happened and make sense of why I was made to feel like I was to blame for the kinds of overwhelming changes that were happening and the events that were happening in my life at the time. And so first it became a way to make sense of my own experience, and that's why it became so personal to me. And then once I'd made that entry point, I then started to realise that women's rights aren't siphoned off from the rest of society. It was almost like a snowballing effect. I started with feminism and then I realised women can't be free until, we defeat race oppression, until we fight class oppression, because all of these things are so intimately tied. So it was the entry point to politics for me and has undergirded everything since then. My entry into politics was emotional before it was intellectual, and that's not something that I shy away from. I think that is something that I'm very proud of, but it's definitely something that through explaining I've managed to process the kind of various ways that gender oppression, race oppression feature in my own life. Were you then as influenced as much by the men who were in your life, and men and boys who were in your life during that time, as the feminist literature itself? So I went to an all-girls school for a lot of my schooling, and then in my last 2 years of schooling, I went to actually an all-boys school that took in a very small number of women in their sixth form. So that was quite a formative experience for me in seeing how a lot of the masculine ways of forming social bonds can be harmful to men. It became really clear to me that men didn't know how to form relationships with women in a way that was conducive for both their happiness and healthiness and women's happiness and healthiness. But I also think we do need to sometimes shift away from dividing people into men and women and look at people as being sort of feminists or patriarchs, because you can have women who behave in a patriarchal manner and pursue a patriarchal system, and men who are very feminist in their orientation. In terms of where we are right now, and of course one can't generalise about feminism as a whole, but am I wrong to detect that there are parts of feminism these days that are as angry about things that are going on, justifiably so in many, many cases, as much as they have ever been, perhaps since the 60s? The level of anger is on occasion is comparable to back then. Yeah, so I think we saw a massive dip, right, in the kind of noughties where feminism really became a dirty word. I remember being the only person who self-described as a feminist in that all-boys school that I was talking about, and it wasn't...
But what happened? How did people respond to that?
Well, it wasn't easy, and I think I faced a lot of hostility, not just from male students, but also from other female students. It was a difficult experience, and I definitely felt very alone. Now I think we're seeing almost the opposite, in that companies and institutions are scrambling to be seen as feminist. And I think whilst this has definitely created a space for women to raise grievances and for kind of gendered oppression to be put into the spotlight, I think in some ways it can be a poisoned chalice because it can be very contradictory. You look at Nike, for example, who recently did a campaign, I think it was called Look What She's Made Of, which was kind of about again, like appropriating that idea of feminism or appropriating an aesthetic of feminism. But then you look at their supply chains. Just last month, 350 women in their sweatshops were hospitalized because of extreme fatigue from poor working conditions. So whilst I think that it's definitely a plus that feminism is not a dirty word anymore, I think what I don't want to see is a defanged feminism that doesn't look at the structural conditions that affect women as a whole. And particularly marginalised and working class women as well. I think we're looking, rather than looking to rewire the system, we're looking at sort of getting women to play by the rules of the game. But the rules of the game are rigged against the majority of women.
At the moment you've got I Stand With Her, you have the Me Too movement. I mean, International Women's Day is a feature of any major organisation's calendar now. Taken together, doesn't that represent significant, more than significant progress?
I don't think we can look at it as progress because when you look at the first, in terms of, I don't think it's a static line sort of going up, because if you look at the first International Women's Day, that to me was one of the most militant moments in feminist history. You had women garment workers, migrant women garment workers in New York going on strike to demand better conditions. That was a collective demand to change the collective experience of women and to change the conditions of the most vulnerable and the most exploited women. To me, that's more progress than a kind of feminism that focuses on putting a female head at the top of a system that entrenches inequality. 70% of the world's poor are women. So if you perpetuate a system that increases that inequality, women are going to be at the sharp edge of that.
I mean, a woman you could perhaps have included in that description there. I mean, Hilary Clinton, so much of her campaign to become president was about having a woman as the first president. I mean, didn't she have a point? I mean, wouldn't that have been more than a significant step forward for there to be the first female president of the United States?
So representation is obviously important. It's obviously important to see people that look like you being celebrated and being revered, right? Or being trusted with that kind of decision-making power. But I don't think the representation is a replacement for systemic change. When you look at Hilary Clinton specifically, and you look at, for example, the fact that she was completely in bed with the fossil fuel industry, the fossil fuel industry contributed millions of dollars to her campaign. When you look at the impact of climate change and the impact of the fossil fuel industry's extractivism globally, 80% of the people that are displaced by climate change are women. We know that women are the most affected by climate change. So to me, that's a massive contradiction, and I don't think that it's a fair payoff.
A lot of what you're saying seems to go to something that you've talked about in your writing, the idea that and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the idea that feminism might be incompatible with capitalism.
A system that has inequality at its heart, I fundamentally don't think can be compatible with an ideology, with a politics that fights for liberation for all. I don't think it's an accident that 70% of the world's poor are women. So for me, socialism and feminism, or rewiring our economic system to be more equal and more based in care and more based in justice, is intimately tied with gender equality and ending gender oppression.
In terms of where feminism sits at the moment, at times it does. There are voices within the feminist movement that seem to have an issue with trans politics as well. Do you understand where some of these people are coming from on that issue? That there's something being lost from the notion of what it is to be a woman?
I absolutely don't think that. We're seeing the most privileged sector of women trying to police the boundaries of womanhood in order to maintain some kind of power within this movement. Trans politics is inherently feminist politics because it challenges the gender binary, and that's fundamentally what feminism has always done.
So what then is the role of men in this struggle? I mean, can a man be a feminist? Can someone without the experiences that you have had be a feminist, truly?
I completely believe they can, of course, because patriarchy is a system that, yes, it benefits men more than it benefits women, but it still does hurt men because it's a system that is based on competition, on violence, on oppression, on hierarchy. And that is something that affects men as well as women, but women do obviously suffer the brunt of it.
Can you understand why there are some men who feel, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, that for women to rise, someone else has to be brought down?
Well, I think that that's symptomatic of the way that our economic and political system is set up. It's set up on the premise of hierarchy, on the premise that it's okay. I think it's the top 27 richest people in the world owning more wealth than the bottom 50%. So when you have a system that's based on hierarchy and based on the incredible riches of some and the incredible poverty of the many, then of course you would think, oh, if for some people to be liberated, other people need to be put down. But when you rewire the entire way that you envisage society, you can see that actually our liberation is completely tied together. And that's why, for me, the Hilary Clinton-style feminism, the Theresa May-style feminism that focuses on the progression of individual, very privileged women is not interesting to me because it doesn't capture that radical potential that feminism has to change society for everyone. I have no interest in leaning into a system that has inequality at its heart, and I have no interest in smashing a glass ceiling if it means that the majority of poor women are cleaning up the shards of that glass ceiling.